Oh, hello, YouTube. Hello. So today I wanted to talk about the 9/11, September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, or attacks at least. So I just wanted to talk about that. I'm Australian, obviously, so my view of it is can be different to the average person in USA. Might even be different to the average person in Australia. It's just my views. So, firstly, same as with anything else I deal with, I start with facts and then draw my opinion based on those facts. So, first thing to know, so on the September the 11th, 2001, which in the American way of writing numbers is 9/11. In Australia, it's 11/9. And in most of the world, it's 11/9. Americans write it the other way around. They put the month first, then the day of the month. We put the day first, then the month. Day, month, year. Anyway, so that's 9/11. And what happened was four aeroplanes were hijacked. Now, the first one flew into the World Trade Center. The second one flew into the World Trade Center. The third one flew into the Pentagon, and the fourth one was it crashed in a field, and it was on its way to Camp David. Now, Camp David being the place where the president would go to sort of hide, if you like, when other terrorist actions have been. So that fourth one was aimed at killing the US president. They predicted that he would go to that bunker and that they would fly the fourth plane in there to kill him. So the US president at the time was George W. Bush. So that you could say fairly clearly that certainly the third and fourth ones were military attacks. Now, throughout history, we've had attacks like this, and we have declared war in relation to them. So, if this sort of attack had been done any time through history and it had been done by a particular country, that country would be attacked and invaded at any time, no matter who was being attacked. It wouldn't matter if you're a small country or a big country. That's a declaration of war. So that would be the normal way of looking at it. We wouldn't look at it as terrorism. We'd look at it as a declaration of war, and that's the kind of thing that it looked like when it happened. Now, who were the people that were doing it is the question, and this is where we get this question from. Now, so if we take it as a declaration of war, the most powerful country and the one that was a number of experts were looking at China as the ones that had done it. That it was a declaration, a threat to USA to say, "Hey, do you have the guts to attack China?" And China before that had done a number of things to attack US military. They'd captured some planes and stolen US military technology, and it was setting up for a war. Now, did China do this? Um, the thing is that if you look at all the news, there was no official uh, complaint against China. No, they weren't questioned. Just didn't happen. It just was like, well, we're not going to pretend, we're not going to consider China. This was very strange, realistically. You're thinking, well, you don't know who did this. And even if it's eight people, two each plane for the four planes, and even if they were from a particular country, you can't say that they weren't employed by China to do this, or convinced by China, or manipulated by China. And it made sense that it would have been China. Now, so that's the first strange thing. The first strange thing. I mean, if we look at the what caused World War One was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and that was a declaration of war. It was said to be a declaration of war, and it led to World War One. Now, why didn't this lead to a world war? It could have. It could have very easily. And so a lot of people would say that if USA had not been diplomatic about this, had told the actual truth about it, it would have led to a world war. It was an attack on US civilians and military, and it would be aiming at a world war. And I think this is probably the most likely scenario. So we're looking at China. China's the first one that we would consider. There's been no investigation about it, and if China had did it, if China were responsible, then we would say, well, people from USA have decided to not blame China and have decided to cover that up. And we're talking about high-level military. talking about Secret Service, we're talking about those sort of people. That's not much of a cover-up. It wouldn't require very many people to cover it up if that had been China. And indeed, that would be the case if that had been anyone else as well. So the first thing, and I've not seen any websites suggest China, which again, strange. Why wouldn't they be considered? They're the most obvious one. I mean, you've got Russia as well, but at the time, Russia were not angry with the USA. In fact, they're still not. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia hasn't been particularly dangerous to USA. They've been quite friendly, comparatively. I mean, they're still not best friends, but they're certainly not at the situation where they would do this sort of thing. Russia wasn't a suspect. And so if we look at suspects, so China's the first one. The second one was Iraq. Okay, so Iraq, as a lot of people would know, and I said in another video, in the terrorism one, so Iraq was invaded by USA after Iraq had annexed Kuwait. So Iraq, that was 9 years earlier, or 10 years earlier. And Iraq were very angry with USA, and they had, well, Saddam Hussein had said that he encouraged people to attack USA. So there's certainly motive from Iraq to do this. Now, let's say that Iraq did do this as an official measure run by their president at the time, Saddam Hussein. If that had happened, the correct response would be an invasion of Iraq. And we did have an invasion of Iraq. But then we didn't do it for this reason. We said that we did it for weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist. So we'll just say, conclusion, if Iraq were responsible for 9/11, then it was correct to go to Iraq. But we should have actually done more. We should have, rounded them up a bit more and been a bit more forceful with it, because we took it as terrorism. Now, I don't know when in terrorism history they've had this sort of, attacking the Pentagon. Yes, terrorists will attack the World Trade Center, which had been bombs, but it wasn't bombs, it was planes. Planes flying in there is reminiscent of kamikaze by the Japanese in World War II. And they were war. That's war. That's not terrorism, it's war. And, you might say, well, it's the same thing. It's not really. The kamikaze pilots in Japan in World War II were not terrorists. They were proud people that were supported in doing that by the Japanese government. So if we're saying that that's the same thing as terrorism, I think we're a little bit off with what we're saying. So let's assume for a moment, let's just play it out. Could it have been Iraq? Now, Iraq could have, and I'm not saying people happening to be from Iraq, but could Iraq have planned the whole thing? Could Saddam Hussein have planned it as attempting to attack USA and to declare war on USA? Could that have happened? And the simple answer is yes. So we've got Saddam Hussein before the invasion of Iraq was threatening USA. He was saying, "Oh, we're going to kill you all. We've got a big army. We've got a million people in our army. We're going to slaughter you." And he was wrong. Iraq got slaughtered, but he still made all those boasts. He was saying, "Oh, let's set up an Islamic State. Let's everybody from every country that's Muslim in the Arab region, let's all join forces and attack USA." And he said that. And I mean, that's not controversial. He said it. And of course, he was borrowing on the talks of, for example, Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and other civil rights movement leaders in USA and in other countries as well, who were not doing it for terrorist reasons. They were doing it for, it was a racial thing. It was a African American pride. And there was a movement that African Americans should become Muslim. And that included in Australia as well in the 1960s. In Australia, we had a lot of Australian Aboriginals become Muslim as part of this racial pride issue, black pride, if you like. And that was part of that. And Saddam Hussein, what he did with that, in a sense, he perverted that from a non-violent movement to a violent movement. And that was what the Islamic State was about. So whether we can say, oh, that was started by Saddam Hussein, probably can't say that, but we can possibly say it was made more violent by Saddam Hussein. And the current ISIS, as it exists, was as a result of the messages from Saddam Hussein. That was a big part of it. The messages that were before the attack of Iraq, so during the attack on Iraq, and after the attack on Iraq by America. So his aim from that was he wanted to be, in a sense, Saddam Hussein, his aim was to be not just the leader of Iraq, but the leader of the Islamic State, which, in his view, was going to be a coalition of all of the Arab Muslim countries. He wanted them to unify into one mega country, if you like, and he was going to call that country the Islamic State. And that country, he believed, could defeat USA, and that was his aim, and that was what he was really pushing for. It didn't eventuate. And what we call now ISIS is not that. It's not that, because ISIS is a terrorist organisation, and what he was aiming for, what Saddam Hussein was aiming for, was a country. And I don't think ISIS is really aiming for that. It's a little bit different. And, so that's the situation. So can we say, did ISIS do 9/11? And they certainly weren't called ISIS then. But I think we can say there's a very good chance that Islamic State, that the people who believed in the Islamic State idea, and these are people from all over the Arab Muslim world, were responsible for this. And I think I believe that's what happened. I think there's a very, very good chance. It's difficult to dispute. It's a claim, if that was, and that was also, that was an act of war, not an act of terrorism. It might have been a little bit of a terrorist thing because Islamic State now is a terrorist group. But at the time, in 2001, Islamic State was a nationalistic movement. They wanted to form a country. They wanted to form one gigantic country that would have all Arab Muslims in it. And it would be involving the whole Middle East, perhaps not counting Israel. But I think that part of that was that they wanted to conquer Israel and turn it over to the Muslims in the area and perhaps call it Palestine. And that was going to be a part of that. And combine all their forces. And, the United States wasn't always one country, and they were a combined country themselves. And there was a time when the Middle East was one country. We know this. It was all one country, and it wasn't always a Muslim country. At the time when it was all one country, it wasn't Muslim. It was traditional groups that were there. But we know that happened in the pre-flood times, in the 10,000 years ago, before the Great Flood. We know that was one country. We've got Herodotus's maps, and we know that was one country. It looked pretty much the same as it does now, but it was all one country. And if that was one country today, I don't think they'd be strong enough to beat USA, but they'd be stronger than they are now. I don't think they'd be strong enough. No, let's be realistic. No, I think China's strong enough. But I think even if all the Arab Muslim countries combined, they would still not be strong enough to defeat USA. But they'd certainly be stronger, and they'd put up a bigger fight, and they'd take down a lot more. And I think that was what he aimed. I think he also was hoping, if you got all the Muslims in the world, that's over 1 billion people. I think it's close to 2 billion now, and that would be big enough to take out USA. That would be. But they're not all Arabs. A number of them, they're in Pakistan, they're in India, and they're not Arabs. And there's people in Indonesia, they're not Arabs. Indonesia is basically a Muslim country, and that's a long way away from the Middle East. So we've got all these different parts that are Muslim that have nothing to do with that. We have European Muslims, and there's, they're all over the world, and that's the difficulty with it. I'm not sure that he wanted the ones from Indonesia, the ones from Pakistan, the ones from South India, and the ones from Bangladesh, or Bangladesh, I should say. So I don't know, but anyway, he wanted an Islamic State. He wasn't the only one that wanted it, but that was something that Saddam Hussein made very clear that he wanted. So if we take the view that he's done 9/11, so can we say that's believable? Well, we've got 8 people now. If we believe the press, we believe the official government story from that. There are 8 people from different parts of the Arab world, from Egypt, from Yemen, and I'm not sure which exact countries, but they were all Arab Muslims. So would they be likely to be people that believed in an Islamic State and believed that USA, through their support of Israel, were preventing it? Because Israel is realistically the major thing that is stopping an Islamic State from existing. If Israel stopped being Israel and became Palestine, it would be a lot easier to have an Islamic State and one giant country in that region. And USA is the main reason that Israel exists. The funding that USA provides to Israel is enormous, and without that, Israel would have been conquered a long time ago. They might have existed for a few years, but they wouldn't have won all their wars. And I mean, if you withdraw the funding for Israel, Israel would still exist for a short period of time, but eventually, if all of the surrounding areas attack them, which they've done before, eventually Israel would succumb, and they would probably abandon their city or their country, and a lot of them would go to USA, so they'd go to different parts of the world. And that's people that are believing in the Islamic State are seeing that as a major barrier, and they see USA, who are supporting Israel more than any other country. Like nobody else does much to support Israel, really. And they do a little bit in different parts of the world, but it's mostly USA, especially for funding. So I think it's 98% that's USA funding for Israel. Here in Australia, we don't have that many Jews. In Melbourne, we have more than the rest of the country, but we don't have very many. It's a tiny proportion. It's not really relevant. And it's not that we hate Jews. It's just that for whatever reason they decided not to come here, and that's the thing. So Israel, people who are believing in the Islamic State believe that Israel is the major barrier, and that USA's support of Israel is the major problem. So attacking USA is a major part of the Islamic State's ideals. They're the main people that they want to attack, and they want to attack the USA on US soil. They don't want to attack them. They don't care if USA goes into Iran or Iraq or Afghanistan or any of those sort of places. Well, they don't like it, but that's not their major issue. Their major issue is getting rid of Israel and creating a giant nation of Islam, the Nation of Islam, Islamic State, whatever you want to call it. And they have called it the Nation of Islam in times past. So to suggest that they could have done 9/11 is very realistic. Iraq was a rich country, richer than Australia. They were up there with USA in per head GDP. In their gross domestic product, they were very rich. The average person there was doing very well. And they were still doing reasonably well by 2001. Certainly, they'd lost a lot of income through the previous war, but they were still doing fairly well. And for them to have the desire to do suicide bombings with the planes, absolutely they did. And the aim, was that the aim of ISIS? Yes. Was that the aim of certainly Saddam Hussein? Yes, that was definitely the aim. And we didn't call it ISIS at the time. It was a term that had been used in the 1960s, and it had meant something very different in those days, because it wasn't a terrorist organisation in 1960. ISIS or Islamic State or Nation of Islam were not terrorist organisations. So this new thing is a terrorist organisation based on things that were not terrorist organisations, that were genuine, positive, good things. Now, when they went and interviewed people after 9/11 happened, one of the people that was interviewed was Osama bin Laden, and I don't know if anyone remembers his speech. It was in Arabic and it was translated into English, and it was along the lines of saying, "I feel very sad for all of the people from America and around the world who died and who were injured in the blasts in 9/11." And he felt very sad, and he wished them sympathy and support, and he wanted to reiterate that Al Qaeda would never attack American civilians. And that was his statement. It was Osama bin Laden's statement. Now, if it was a terrorist act, terrorist group would have said, ha ha ha, we did this horrible thing to you. Aren't we powerful and great? You should give in to our demands. And when you look at like a recent terrorist attack last week in Melbourne, here in Melbourne, terrible thing. And this man that set his car on fire with a gas bomb, and then when people came to help him out, he stabbed them. He stabbed 3 people. He stabbed one person and killed him, and the other 2 didn't get killed. And there was somebody with a shopping trolley that intervened, someone with a chair, and then police came in, and to probably saved lives. We only had 1 person die. We might have had 9 or 10 or 12. Now, that was a terrorist act. ISIS accepted responsibility for it. They went straight away and said, yeah, we did this. Ha ha ha, aren't we evil? 9/11 happened. Al-Qaeda didn't accept responsibility. And they said, oh, well, we're sorry about it. If they had been responsible, I think it stands to reason they would have accepted responsibility for it, because that's what terrorist groups do. They often accept responsibility for things they didn't do. That if somebody else did something that is along their aims, they would accept responsibility falsely. So we can say with a fair degree of confidence that Al-Qaeda didn't do 9/11. And now, what did Saddam Hussein say when he was interviewed? He could speak some English, and so he said along the lines of, ha, 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 you American pig dogs, you imperialistic jerks, and, ha, 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 you've suffered for what you did to us. That was what Saddam Hussein said. Now, he didn't admit to doing the thing. He went very close to admitting to it, though. And that was the first interview he had. Then, of course, he was threatened with war, and then he went, oh, well, maybe it wasn't us. But, look, it was a Franz Ferdinand sort of situation. He was essentially admitting to it, but sort of not sure if he should admit to it. So that's saying to me that Saddam Hussein and Iraq, or at least Saddam Hussein's Iraq, not necessarily every person in Iraq, obviously, that's a different situation. They didn't necessarily want him as their leader, but we're saying that the inner circle, Saddam Hussein, were doing this. And it's not ISIS, it wasn't ISIS because ISIS didn't exist, but it was with that aim, with the aim to set up an Islamic State. Because just imagine, had they killed the American president, and that was their aim, ultimately, that, if you think of the World Trade Center bombing as a distraction, so that the president was sent to the bunker, they attacked the Pentagon so the Pentagon couldn't react properly, and their aim was to kill the US president. And I think realistically we can say that was their aim. I think it's very likely, very obvious that was their ultimate aim. And not just to kill the president, but to kill as many people within the US president group. So maybe the vice president, maybe some other leaders, and to kill them and murder them. And their aim to do that was then in the hope that then they would not give as much funding to Israel, and they would know that they would attack someone. So they did that, and then hoping to set up this Islamic State. And it took a while, but I think that worked, because we now do have an Islamic State terrorist group. Now, it's not a country, so it didn't work to that extent. But I think that we can say that their aims succeeded. And they didn't get the war. America should have declared war on them, and they didn't. They declared war on terror, but it wasn't really a terrorist act. And that makes sense. Now, if we look at Al-Qaeda, what was Al-Qaeda about? They were about defensive, if you like. So they took, when USA attacked Iraq, and they didn't like them being in Saudi Arabia and interfering. And so they attacked American interests overseas, which ISIS didn't do. So in a sense, you had 2 groups. And at the time, it was Iraq versus Al-Qaeda. They were not friends. Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were not friends. They didn't have the same ideas. So you had defensive, that's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda were, and by defensive I mean they were attacking people in every country besides USA. and where US troops were. So when US troops were in Kenya, they attacked them. They attacked the Kenyan embassy, which is not troops, obviously, and they attacked ships and planes and soldiers and civilians as well. They were terrorists. I mean, they weren't legitimate nice guys. They were terrorists. That's Al Qaeda. Now, ISIS were going into London, into Madrid, into Spain, England, France, they would Australia and America, and they've done this. So that's ISIS. Their aim was to attack them. ISIS have gone around and they've destroyed ancient statues and civilizations, that archaeological buildings, historical sites. Al Qaeda didn't do any of that. So if you like, ISIS are worse than Al Qaeda. And if we look at it, and if we think, so let's just assume that we're believing that Al Qaeda did this. If Al Qaeda did it, Al Qaeda would have, well, what was their aim for it? What were they trying to do for it? How is that going to get people to their cause of stopping the American empire, if you like? Because that was their stated aim, was to stop the American empire. It was, how does attacking USA and killing civilians, how does that help their cause? How does it help their cause to attack the World Trade Center? To attack the Pentagon, of course, that helps their aim. But even still, they promised they would never attack USA, because their aim, they wanted USA to just go back into USA and to stop being the world police. That was the stated aim, to stop, to say, hey, USA, we're happy with you being a country, we're happy with your people, we just want you to stop bullying other countries, essentially. Whilst ISIS's aim was very different. ISIS wanted to be a mega country, which they were then wanted to control the world. Well, not necessarily. I mean, it depends on your view of what Islamic State is trying to do. Certainly, if they had 2 billion people out of a total world population of 7, the other 5 billion are not unified against them. So they would have a chance of going around controlling the world. So if you're Muslim and you wanted to be part of that Islamic State, part of that mega country, not necessarily as terrorists, but part of a giant combined country, what would be the aim once that's formed is to try to take on the rest of the world. And the rest of the world would be the 3 most powerful countries, USA, Russia, and China, would have to unify in order to have a chance to beat them. I mean, I've just said before that USA would beat a combined Arab Muslim group, but if they managed to include all of the world's Muslims, I think USA would struggle, and they would want the support of Russia and China. Now, obviously, we've got other big countries. We've got India as well. They're very big in population. I'm not sure their military is at a level where they can be as powerful as the other 3, but they would probably be one that they'd want their support as well. And India is probably the 4th largest. I mean, most of the countries in the world are only 30, 40 million, and India's got 1 billion. So, how's Germany? Is Germany going to be as strong as India? Probably not. So Australia, certainly, we would have no chance against India with 25 million. If India decided to invade Australia, Australia would lose. And we'd lose to Russia. We'd lose to lots of countries. I mean, we're a small country, and we'd probably beat a few countries. We'd probably beat New Zealand. But, we might beat Indonesia, but it'd be close. But, yeah, if it was a holy war, and we're talking about there's more Christians than are Muslims, and that's true. But would Christians unite against Muslims? Some would. Most wouldn't. And I think that's realistic, because Christianity is divided quite a lot. Got the Roman Catholic and then what they call Protestants, and then we divide a lot further after that. Muslims are split as well. You've got Sunni and Shiite, and there might be split beyond that. I'm not really up to date with it, but yeah. So we're looking at that, and you say, was it Al Qaeda or was it ISIS? And I think the facts point towards ISIS, and that's a reality. So why then, if it was ISIS, why did we go to Afghanistan? And if it was Al Qaeda, why did we go to Afghanistan? Al Qaeda was not in Afghanistan. That was the Taliban. And if you looked at the news reports at the time, they were talking about Taliban and then talking about Al Qaeda as if they were the same place, as if they were the same group. The Taliban were a political group, that they were Muslim, and they were trying to run Afghanistan as if in a very strict religious way. And in the part of that was that they didn't allow people from any other religion to exist in their country. Now, if you did exist, you had to wear different symbols and so forth to point out your religion, and you weren't allowed to practice the religion. So one penalty that they had was that if you practiced Christianity in any way, then you could be executed, you could be hung. This is something that a lot of people, most of the world, disagreed with. The Taliban were never accepted as the rulers of Afghanistan, except by Pakistan. So Pakistan said, yeah, you're the rulers. Everybody else said, you're not the legitimate rulers. And so when we had 9/11, as coincidentally, and it's not related, Afghanistan had 8 different people. I think 6 were from USA, and there was at least 1 Australian, and they were said to be members of Red Cross. So they were foreign aid workers, and they were all tried and charged with being Christian, practicing Christianity. They were definitely Christian, but they were charged with practicing Christianity, and so their penalty was going to be hanging. And USA had appealed to the United Nations to allow them to invade Afghanistan to the extent of rescuing those 8 foreign aid workers. And the United Nations said no. They said, you don't have the right to do that. It'll cause too many problems. And so they didn't have that right. What happened as a result of going to Afghanistan was that those foreign aid workers were freed. And when the Taliban were interviewed in the wake of 9/11, they offered to give up those foreign aid workers. It was the first thing they did. And then they said, well, we'll give up we'll give up Osama bin Laden, we'll give up everybody that we know that's Al Qaeda. And then they said, Al Qaeda isn't here. And then America invaded. So I think we can say very clearly that the reason to go to Afghanistan was to stop the Taliban, and in particular to save those 8 foreign aid workers. Mission accomplished. We did that. Well done. And I think Afghanistan is probably a better place as a result of that. I think all I've heard is that Afghanistan now is better than it was then. So they appreciated the invasion. It wasn't really protested by anybody. We all, Al Qaeda didn't say, oh, we shouldn't be there. They were just like, well, we know you're there to get rid of the Taliban and to free the foreign aid workers, and that's fair enough. That was essentially what they were saying. They weren't dealing with terrorism in Afghanistan. Now, when they went to Iraq, and again, this is what I've said, when they went to Iraq after the weapons of mass destruction situation, they dealt with a lot of terrorists. And they dealt with Al Qaeda. And Al Qaeda were in Iraq. What was Al Qaeda doing in Iraq? They were convincing people to blow up insurgencies, all sorts of stuff, like things like that. And then when they finished all that, they got rid of Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda essentially doesn't exist anymore. They then saw ISIS start. And ISIS was there already, but they weren't acknowledging it. So ISIS was existing, and it was never the same thing as Al Qaeda. They were opposites. But once they got rid of Al Qaeda, they noticed that there was something much worse, and that was ISIS. Something that I think a lot of things that were blamed on Al Qaeda were actually ISIS. It's hard to separate them, but was ISIS in Iraq? I mean, I think ISIS started in Iraq, realistically. Then it moved to Syria. And we've seen them in Nigeria. That's technically, that was a different group, but I think it's all the same ideal. They kidnapped those children and the girls, little girls, and tried to force them to become Muslim and become sex slaves. We still haven't got them back, or got a few back, but not really. And I think that's related to ISIS. That's related to the idea of a country that's for Muslims, an entire mega country, like you know, what they're aiming for is the Muslim equivalent of the United States of America. You know, where that's what they're aiming for. So they would have, you know, let's say that, I don't know what they would call it, Islamic State. Let's just say they call it the Nation of Islam, and they would then have the state of Iraq, the state of Syria, the state of Iran, you know, the different states, the state of Saudi Arabia, the state of United Arab Emirates, which itself is different states. But they would have all of those different groups as part of the country. And potentially they could have Nigeria as a state, and they could have Pakistan and Bangladesh as states, and South India as a state. They might even want to take over the whole of India. I don't know. They might have Palestine as a state. They would be different states of the Nation of Islam. So when we're looking at that, I think the evidence really does make it very clear that ISIS did 9/11. So, and I think that America lied about it. I think that whenever I talk about these things, when people have lied, I think you look back on it and you say, we shouldn't have lied. If they'd gone straight to Iraq and attacked Iraq, I don't think the Islamic State would have risen in the way that it did. If they'd, you know, dealt with Afghanistan separately and not pretended that that was the 9/11 revenge, then we would have dealt with that a lot better. I mean, look, perhaps those foreign aid workers would have died if we hadn't gone to Afghanistan. And it's difficult to say. You're putting people's lives, 8 people's lives versus 1 million people's lives. That's a difficult decision to make. And they went and attacked Afghanistan to save 8 people's lives at the expense of 1 million people's lives. And I think they knew that at the time. So if you've got 8 versus 1 million, it's a difficult moral question to ask. But I think that the bottom line, you've got to say, they lied to people. They lied to say it was Al Qaeda. They lied to say that it was the Taliban. And I think if by telling the truth, those 8 people had died, look, it's a very difficult thing to say, but 8 versus 1 million. And I don't think there's a guarantee that those 8 people would have died. They might have just been captured and stayed in jail for a while and then eventually been released. I don't think we can say with certainty that they would have died. So when we're looking at this and we look at it, and I've seen those conspiracy theories about it that say, oh, America did a bomb and they blew up the building rather than have planes flying. Well, for that to be true, you'd have to have millions of people in on the conspiracy. And what's the payoff? So the payoff, first of all, and I'll just acknowledge this, this conspiracy theory. So the bombing, the controlled detonation idea, there were people on the planes that were seeing useful footage. People eyewitnessed it. Now, the first one wasn't seen, it was seen by hardly anyone. The second one was seen. Third one was seen. Fourth one was seen. And you've got, for that to be faked, I mean, the biggest conspiracies in the world have had maybe 1,000 people involved. This would have taken millions, literally millions. And what's the payoff? Why would you kill your own people? What? I mean, you're not even killing your own citizens, you're killing people from other countries as well, because the World Trade Center wasn't just Americans. It had people from England, it had people, Arabs in it. So why are you killing them? Why are you killing your own people? And you've got to say, well, you wouldn't. Sometimes you use Pearl Harbor as an example. I mean, some estimations are that there were 1,000 people died in Pearl Harbor, so that America could win the war, enter the war, win the war, and become a superpower afterwards. So if we assume that, and I might make another video about Pearl Harbor, but that's worth it. Do you see what I mean? Because you've killed your own people there by manipulation of Japan, forcing them to bomb you, all that sort of thing. You've killed your own people. Look at the payoff. It's enormous. It's worth it. I mean, I'm not saying that it's worth it to kill 1,000 people so that you can be a rich country, but I think a lot of people would say that it was. And if we compare that with killing people in 9/11, it's not worth it. And that's where the conspiracy theory falls flat. And in fact, all the versions of the conspiracy theory, well, they have a lot of useful information, and they've researched their facts, and they've got a lot of facts right. They're missing that one important conclusion: is that you wouldn't kill your own people like that for no reason, for no benefit. I mean, countries have killed their own people. Saddam Hussein killed Kurds. We've had people have killed an entire race from their own people, an entire group. Khmer Rouge. We've had Pol Pot. It might be the same people. Anyway, we've had a few people have done these sort of things, but it's not. You're not killing random people in your own country. You're killing specific people. When Joseph Stalin killed his own people because they were people he believed were a threat to him. What are the people in the World Trade Center? Why are they a threat to American people? Was it staged? No. There was too many witnesses. So every popular conspiracy theory there we can say is false. All the ones that relate to that. If there's a conspiracy theory that agrees with me, that says ISIS did it, that Saddam Hussein did it, I'll agree with that. But there isn't one, of course, because what I'm saying here is not a conspiracy theory. I don't support conspiracy theories. A lot of people get confused. They think that because I don't always agree with the official rhetoric that I'm pushing a conspiracy theory. I'm not. I'm just pushing. I'm saying what makes sense. And we know how conspiracy theories work. We know how governments work with how they do things, and we know that it's about when they create the official story, they simultaneously create a false story for you all to follow. So I think that the conspiracy theory that the American government was involved was created by the American government. And I think that's fairly obvious. So the people in the FBI, probably not the FBI doing it, but let's say people in the CIA would have been orchestrating that information, feeding breadcrumbs to people so that they could believe the USA attacked their own people. And they give false information to people. That's how they create a false a conspiracy theory. It's called disinformation. They've got a word for it because it's something that we see time and time again, that we have this disinformation out there. So they do that to push this so that you can believe, so the average person there, I mean, if we're looking at it, people that believe the official story is probably 80%, and we're looking at 19% believe that same conspiracy theory, which makes no sense. They know that the official story doesn't make sense, but they're believing this alternative, which makes even less sense. And you've got a few people that go around and they ignore those two and they say, or they don't follow those two and they say, hey, what's really going on? Now, I said at the start that China was an obvious one. I haven't dismissed the idea that China did 9/11. But what I'm saying is there's no evidence of it. There's no evidence they didn't. And what I'm saying is that it's more compelling that Saddam Hussein, Iraq, and ISIS, or beginnings of ISIS, the pre-ISIS, if you like, that they did 9/11, and that America knows that. And I think that makes sense. That's reasonably obvious. And I think that Al Qaeda had nothing to do with it, and Afghanistan had nothing to do with it. So we blamed Al Qaeda. We blamed Osama bin Laden because Osama bin Laden was public enemy number one for USA before that happened. He had gone around Europe and he had been doing public speaking tours during the war in Iraq after, and he had been drumming up support against USA. So at the time of the 9/11 bombing, the international view of USA was very, very low. And a lot of that was because of Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. So he was releasing video after video saying why America was evil, why George Bush was evil, why his father was evil. And, George W. and we just call him George H. Bush or George Bush Sr., that they were considered to be evil by Osama bin Laden, and he was pushing that, and he had millions of supporters all around the world, not just in Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or Middle East, but in Europe, people that weren't Muslim. And it was, he spoke in the same way that I'm speaking now and was just drumming up support. But at the end of it, he'd say, and it's okay to attack and kill these people. I'm not saying that, so don't get me mixed up with Osama bin Laden. But he was hated by America. He was number one on their public enemy list, that they wanted him killed. They were trying to assassinate him for a long time. They wanted to bring down Al Qaeda. And if you look at the damage to USA, if you're USA, who do you hate more, Al Qaeda or ISIS? And we have to consider that they both existed at the time of 9/11. I think realistically they did. It wasn't called ISIS, but it existed. So if we say that, who did USA hate the most? Al Qaeda, because Al Qaeda was really ruining their reputation. ISIS wasn't. All ISIS wanted to do was to build their own country, their own mega country, which doesn't necessarily affect USA. It only affected USA through Israel. So different aims, different groups. Al Qaeda were much more of a threat to USA, and that's why they were blamed. ISIS wasn't considered any threat at all at the time. They thought, people in America thought, well, I mean, the American intelligence groups. And I mean, I'm speculating here. I'm just sort of working out what I think that they thought. I'm not actually revealing hidden secrets, but I mean, I think it's really reasonably easy to work out. They considered Al Qaeda a bigger threat at the time, and at the time they were. ISIS, worst case scenario, they'd take out Israel. America, I think, would be prepared to put up with that. They know that Israel is so well defended with their dome that their citizens would be able to get out before they were taken out, and you would have minimal loss of life there. Most of them would be airlifted to USA. So, in worst case, that Israel was defeated, the Israeli citizens probably wouldn't die. And they would know that. That's what Al Qaeda doesn't care about Israel. ISIS does. That's the difference. Well, that's one of the differences. There's a number of differences between the two groups. They were in opposition to each other. They're both Muslim. They both hate America, but they're not the same group. And yeah, I think USA at the time was like, well, let's just put up with ISIS. And I don't think that they thought it through to see that ISIS were going to attack USA, and that they were going to attack England, they were going to attack Australia, they were going to attack Spain, they were going to attack France, they were going to attack, and I'm sure there's other countries, and I apologise if I missed some. But they weren't thinking that through that far, and because I think at the time ISIS weren't very strong, and I think having 8 people willing to give up their lives to kill American and other citizens, they weren't all American. I think that's that's not as big as what Al Qaeda's doing, and that's what I think they blamed it on Al Qaeda when they should have been blaming it on ISIS, and in fact they should have been blaming it on Iraq. And there were American politicians that pointed this out, and they were hushed, they were silenced. When I went forward at the time in 2001, and I wasn't aware that someone in the American political spectrum was saying the same thing as I was. I wasn't aware of it. And I was told that not only was I a conspiracy theorist, but I was a rare conspiracy theorist that was pushing something that nobody was pushing, that 0.01% of people were listening to. And as time has gone on, that theory has proven more and more true. That Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and ISIS, the beginnings of ISIS, the pre-ISIS, that they did 9/11. It was the same 8 people. They could have forged those names. They certainly wouldn't have taken a lot to forge those names. It would have been a very small conspiracy. You would have required maybe 15 people to lie in order to forge those names. But I don't think that's an important part of it. There's also, and I still remember this, they said, well, we can prove that they got money. Are you serious? Suicide bombers got paid to be suicide bombers. Are you the dumbest person in the world? That's not a motivator. Being paid, even if the family were paid, that's not a motivator either. You agree to be a suicide bomber because you believe in the cause. We had suicide bombers in the IRA. We had them in the Tamil Tigers. We've had them in most terrorist groups. It's a part of it. But if you've got terrorist bombers with bomb straps to their chest or whatever, do you get paid to do that? You might get given it, but that's not your motivation. The money trail that they talked about was irrelevant. And I think that it's strange that people accepted that. I find that really odd. That wasn't a part of the actual evidence. That was, and they could have easily forged that, really easily. And it never really traced back to Al Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. Anyway, they made all these different little strange little assumptions that, I mean, bottom line, it's not a believable angle, but that's relevant. So whoever those 8 people were, and I also went by the theory that the 8 people could have done it themselves without being terrorists, without being anything. And that America just pretended it was all these different things. Could have been a group of 8 people that got together on weekends and said, "Oh, let's do this thing, let's do it." I mean, you look at the mass shootings that we have, they're not organised. It's just one person, sometimes 2 people, just decide to kill a lot of people. They're not terrorists. They still kill people. So there was a possibility that, and there still is a possibility, that those 8 people were unrelated to anyone. That they just were a group of 8 people who all believed that they wanted to kill as many people as possible before they died. And it's possible. If I didn't have Saddam Hussein saying those things that he said, you'd say, well, that's a possibility. It still is a possibility. And I'm open to that possibility. I'm still open to the possibility China did it. I've seen no evidence that China did it. I've seen no evidence that China didn't. I think the most likely one is that Saddam Hussein, Iraq, and ISIS are responsible for 9/11, and that it was intended as an act of war, not as a terrorist act. And I think separating an act of war and a terrorist act is kind of important. And if we look at that and we change the definition too much, it becomes a bit misleading. And then we've got a situation now where we think, well, terrorism and Islam are the same thing. Some people are saying that. I mean, if we revealed and we found out that the whole thing was organised by China, we might find that one day. All those people who are calling this a terrorist act and saying it was Muslims and saying it was Al Qaeda will look stupid. Not just stupid, but dangerous, particularly if they knew, if it was China and they knew. I mean, if it was China, there'd be a big motive to hide that because USA couldn't. I mean, they could possibly defeat China. I don't know. You have to weigh it up, but they would take a lot of losses. It might wipe out half of their population in defeating China, and that's too big a risk, too big a loss. So it might wipe out the whole of China. Assuming China fought to the last man, you might see the whole of China wiped out. 100 million US citizens wiped out, and 100 million more diseased, disfigured. Is that worth it? Probably not. And so they're avoiding that war by blaming Qaeda. That's if China did it. Again, I've seen no evidence that they did. I've seen no evidence they didn't. China had the greatest motive to do it. But I personally believe that Saddam Hussein did it. I think that's the most likely one of the 3 options. So the 3 options that actually make sense is, number 1, Saddam Hussein did it. Number 2, the 8 people just wanted to take out as many as they could with a similar motivation to the mass shooters. They were just 8 people. wanted to kill as many people as they could. You know, feeling like heroes in doing it. You know, took down 5,000 people. We got lost 8. 8 versus 5,000. They won. You know, and then people with that mentality, it's not terrorism. It's still evil. It's arguably, terrorism is arguably not as evil as a mass shooter. Mass shooters are amoral, they don't care. Terrorists are immoral. They know they're doing evil. Doing it. So, I'll say that again. So I had 1 was ISIS. Number 2, just 8 people. Number 3, China. I think China's the least likely of those 3, but I still think it's a possibility, and it's one that we can't exclude. I think they've most likely at this stage, the people in the intelligence agencies they would know which of those 3 it was. My evidence that it was Saddam Hussein is not just his mission, but also the fact that we invaded Iraq a second time under unjustifiable reasons. The weapons of mass destruction thing was a lie. They still did it, and then they publicly executed Saddam Hussein. That tells me that it was ISIS. And the result of ISIS later tells me it's ISIS. It's circumstantial evidence, but it makes it the most likely outcome. I think if it was 8 people doing it by themselves, they wouldn't have bothered to attack Iraq a second time, and they wouldn't have bothered to publicly execute Saddam Hussein. And the ISIS wouldn't have grown as big as they have if it was 8 people acting alone. And if it was China, I don't think we would have attacked Iraq. I think if it was China, I don't think we might have still attacked Afghanistan. We might have still blamed Al Qaeda, but I think that we would have stopped there. I would have stopped there, and then perhaps planned to do something about China, and we would have had talks and after talks after talks. There's been no talks between USA and China. That tells me it's not China. It could have been China. I can't prove that it wasn't China, but I can prove it's not Al Qaeda. What's the difference? They're still terrorists. They're still Muslim terrorists. This was an act of war. It wasn't a terrorist act. Okay, and it was a different group. So I think that, as with a lot of things, when we tell the truth, it's important. When we know the truth, it's important. And when we go there and we say, well, it's all Muslims, well, ISIS is not all Muslims. Al Qaeda is not all Muslims. Al Qaeda were more popular than ISIS, but ISIS arguably more powerful. I think if I was going to do a scale of evil, I'd say ISIS is more evil than Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda, yes, I think in a lot of ways, Al Qaeda had reasonably noble views. They still killed people. I mean, putting a ranking of who's the worst terrorist, it's a strange little way to do it, but I do think that ISIS is worse than Al Qaeda, and I think that if we look at it, if we accept that ISIS did 9/11, then we've got to say, well, the way that we've handled the situation has been very poor. And looking into the future, the way we should handle it is to go back in time, go, all right, should have done this, should have done this, should have done this, and then say, moving forward, this is what we will do to deal with it. And I've already said an effective way to deal with it is to just sweep through, to get the Muslim community on side and to get them to help to deal with terrorism in their own community, even if the terrorists are not attacking them, to encourage it, to dob your mate in, to say, he's a terrorist, here you go, and do what they can. And I think that a war on terror is justified. I think it's essentially a war on evil. And I've spoken about that. I think that good people should support a war on terror, and we should be going out there and doing what we can to get rid of it. Just absolutely get rid of it. It's not just in the Muslim community, obviously, but I think that at the stage we're at, we have more terrorists now than we've ever had before in humanity, as a proportion, not just as a raw number, and we need to get rid of them. And it's important. It's a big deal, and I would not want to have. I mean, the idea of an Islamic State in itself is not bad. If you have it in the Arab Muslim area and you combine 10 or 12 countries into one under Islamic rule, that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're not going to be as strong as the current world leaders, even if they're combined. But the idea of doing that under a terrorist regime is dangerous. We don't want to have a massive terrorist country that's 12 countries worth. If Islamic State, or the Nation of Islam, was one giant country that was run in a sensible way, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. So, yeah, I think that particularly Americans, I think, and as part of all this, I think Israel has to be the focus, and know whether you have an exit plan to safely evacuate everyone in Israel, or if you just go to Israel and just use that as your base camp to go through all the Muslim countries and to say, right, we're going to look for terrorists and we're going to work with your governments to get rid of them, and that's a good thing. Yeah, so in some ways, I mean, I try to dumb things down, but it is difficult to not let it be complicated. But I still think we've got to try our best to simplify it as much as we can, and to say, hey, okay, we lied about 9/11, but the lie wasn't this conspiracy theory that all of you silly people believe. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't say silly people. Goodness. Look, if you believe in this conspiracy theory, then you're at least awake enough to realise that the government is lying to you. But if you then blindly believe it without checking anything, without following it through, without being logical, you're worse than the people that just blindly believe the official story. At least the official story makes a little bit of sense. There's a logical conclusion. And in a lot of cases, the official story is true. Now, the official story about the recent attack in Melbourne, I'm not disputing it. I don't think there was a conspiracy theory associated with it. I think the guy really did do what the government has said. And a lot of stories, even controversial ones, the official story is true. Even when you've got a conspiracy theory. A lot of times it is true. But believing in the possibility that you're being lied to is a good thing. That's you're halfway there. And I think what you've got to do after that is look for the possibility that the conspiracy theory is a lie as well. And then you look for what might have actually happened. I think any time when you've got a popular conspiracy theory, you're probably looking at Secret Service, spies, intelligence agency involvement, and that you should then look for the third story in that case. And it's fairly easy to look for. So when I'm saying silly people, I apologise for that. I shouldn't say those words, but look, I think it's very rare for conspiracy theories to be true. Certainly, if they become popular, it's very unusual. But for something beyond that, yeah, I think there's a very good chance. And I think if I was going to put percentages on there, I'd say that there's at least a 90% chance that Saddam Hussein, Iraq, and ISIS did 9/11. At least 90%. I'm not 100% certain. Said that there were two options. They're either by themselves, sort of mass shooter sort of situation, or China did it. I don't think there's any other option. I certainly don't think Al Qaeda did it. I think the likelihood of that is almost zero. And the idea that USA did it themselves is zero. So if you like, we've got those 5 things in that order. Most likely Saddam Hussein, Iraq, and all that. Second most likely is that 8 people in a mass shooter situation just wanted to kill as many people as they could. Third most likely China did it. Fourth most likely Al Qaeda did it, which is the official story. And least likely is that America just blew it up themselves and things that just don't make sense. So, I don't mean if you've got another theory, there might be another theory that's up there. That's my conclusion for it. But some people ask me to talk about 9/11. I mean, I'm not going to be as knowledgeable about 9/11 as I would be about things in Australia, but I think I've worked that out fairly comprehensively at this stage. So I hope you can follow that, and please let me know if you like this. Hopefully no one's too abusive about it, but this is the internet, people can be abusive. Look, I'm not doing this with any agenda at all. This is just what I've worked out, what I think is true. So if you think I'm true, well, good. If you don't, that's okay too. So yeah, there you go. All right. So that's it on 9/11. I don't really have much more to say about that. Obviously, if you're somebody that has, if your family members died, if you were there, and it's a horrible situation to be in, and I have nothing but sympathy for you. And I don't know if it helps your situation at all, or makes any difference to think that it might have been ISIS rather than Al Qaeda. Probably doesn't make any difference at all to you. I doubt that it would make any difference. It might even make you angry, and I apologise if it made you feel angry. I'm not trying to make people feel angry. And if you're someone that was in an intelligence agency and you know that what I'm telling is true, which I think you probably will, I haven't spilled any secrets here. This is all public information. So I'm just using my little brain to work things out. So yeah, I'm sure I'm not going to get 1 million views or anything, and I'm not going to have people challenge CIA or whoever about this. It's not a WikiLeaks situation. I haven't got special information. I'm just revealing what's in the public knowledge. It's out there. So, and I'm just putting my interpretation of it. So, yeah. Okay, so I think I've covered everything there. So, all right. So, thanks YouTube for putting this up. I'm sorry, I'm not very animated. I'm not good with graphics. I'm just doing this on the computer, being very basic. So, perhaps one day I'll have better graphics. Okay, and better expressions because my eyes look really small. Yeah, okay, bye bye then. See ya.